difference. On the other hand, there's some areas where the age doesn't make any difference at all. When I was, let me just go to one area. When I was an undergraduate student in mining engineering, I never looked at where ore deposits were as I was being taught as a mining engineer based on ages. It was completely irrelevant, which is kind of hard to believe. It's a geological profession, but nobody is looking at ore deposits based on ages. They're always looking based on associations. Gold is associated with this. Copper is generally associated with this. Coals are associated with this. You look for associations, even for oil. Oil is generally associated with these structural geological areas. So we're not using age. Age is totally irrelevant. As a medical doctor, age is completely irrelevant. In fact, evolution is completely irrelevant. Nobody cares, and nobody uses it in the practice of medicine. From a pragmatic standpoint of view, the age and everything is irrelevant. However, when it comes to sequencing genomes and when it comes to finding out information from the genome, age is somewhat important because we know that mutations happen, and not all mutations are lethal. In fact, most mutations are not lethal, and therefore if they happen in your germ cells, they get passed on to your offspring. And they tend to build up and they tend to accumulate in the human population. And as best as we can see, and of course there's a lot of variability in this, they accumulate at a specific rate. And when we try to extrapolate the rate backwards at which mutations are accumulating in populations, not just the human population, but in various populations, you cannot extrapolate far enough back to get to, as Dr. Ross mentioned earlier today, a supposed human ancestor of 200,000 years ago. It just won't go back that time. The human population would have been completely destroyed by mutations, and when we extrapolate backwards, they don't go back that long. So when we're talking about sequencing genomes, it is important. And I have another colleague of mine, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, who works for Answers in Genesis. He's been doing the same type of research on mitochondrial genomes, which is a stretch of DNA, which is contained in the little powerhouses of your cells called the mitochondria, which is generally inherited from the mother, and it also accumulates mutations at a specific rate. And he has done research on, I believe, over 1,500 groups of organisms. And in this particular case as well, you cannot extrapolate back more than 5,000 to 6,000 years based on his research. So in this case, age is not the friend of evolutionists, as in many other cases, age is their enemy.
And let me just flip this question for a moment, because there are evolutionists who say that unless, let's say, a graduate student believes in evolution, he can't do biology. I don't want him in my graduate program. That's pretty silly too, right?
That's extremely silly. I suppose it would depend on what your graduate program is, but if you're going to do something useful like medicine, then sorry for any other graduate programs, it's kind of irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant what you believe in this. And in fact, even evolutionists have mentioned if nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution, why do so many biologists, in terms of practicing, ignore evolution? Why do so many plant biologists ignore evolution? Why do so many medical fields ignore evolution? Because it's completely irrelevant. And I would obviously argue, even in geology, since most practical applications of geology, of looking for ore deposits and everything like I mentioned, have nothing to do with age, it should be irrelevant there. I would kick it over to Dr. Ross. I wouldn't dare to answer, but is it irrelevant for paleontology or something like that? Would a secular person have a legitimate reason for keeping someone out of their program if they either didn't believe in evolution or didn't believe in these long ages?
It's an issue that I faced because for me, I was a young earth creationist from the very beginning of my college career and made that known to my advisors along each step of the way at the 3 different schools that I was at, which was a dangerous thing for me to do, and sometimes maybe a bit foolhardy, it seemed, to think that it would be okay. And I nearly got thrown out of my master's program at the South Dakota School of Mines and Tech as a result of being too advocatory outside of the classroom, not inside the classroom. For paleontologists, one of the troubles that you run into is that Darwin's concept of universal ancestry provides a way for paleontologists to anticipate what they will find in the fossil record. So if you've got two different animals and they're supposed to share a common ancestor, then you have predictions about what those things ought to be. That's something that, quite honestly, we're lacking a bit in creationism right now. We don't know what to expect from the fossil record in a creationist framework as far as what should I be looking for. I should be looking for kinds, I should be looking for things, but what should they be specifically? And we just haven't had very much time to think about what we should be looking for in the fossil record. So given that evolution provides a framework for investigation in the first place, I don't think it's legitimate to exclude creationists from paleontology at all. I think that's a horrible sort of thing to do. And for the evolutionists, it's also a very bad PR sort of thing when it gets discovered that you've excluded someone, usually framed in terms of religious actions or what have you. But the concept of ancestry is so fundamental to the way paleontology is done that I understand why my colleagues in evolution think that you just can't be a paleontologist unless you're an evolutionist. That's not true, because you can still look at paleontology, even if you don't want to follow the evolutionary arguments. You can look at, as you had mentioned, paleopathology, right? This discipline within paleontology to look at diseases in organisms, or comparative anatomy, because there's very much that we can learn from other organisms about ourselves and the way that they do things versus the way we do things. Sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're very different. That has medical applications in some cases. Fossils can tell us about environments or organizations of environments and ecosystems, and those things can be independent of evolution as well. But I think for anybody who is interested in paleontology, the key is actually to become a very good evolutionist while you're a creationist. Professor Lee here at Patrick Henry College was very much of the same mind. We went to places like the South Dakota School of Mines and Tech because we could get training in paleontology, a discipline that we loved. We knew that it would fill us with ideas about evolution, but we also knew that by doing that, we'd be able to see what evolution's evidences and arguments were full force. Dr. Clary as well, going through his programs in geology, where likewise it's really in your face all over the place. And then you get to learn what is a good evolutionary argument, what's a bad evolutionary argument, and hopefully what make better creationist arguments, so that I don't make an argument against a bad evolutionary argument. I don't care about bad evolutionary arguments as much. There's plenty of them. We could spend a lot of time on them. But I need to know what the good evolutionary arguments are so that I can provide a better understanding from a young Earth creation perspective. And that's the big value, I think, in going into some of the fields where evolution is so strongly put. And Dr. Lyle had a lot of experience with this in terms of stellar astronomy. He's got to be faced with the good arguments as well as some of the bad arguments in astronomy on those types of things. And it makes him a far better creationist for having done so.
The sun is blaring on my face.
Okay, Dr. Lyle, and this is being thrown to you because Dr. Morris had to leave. Dr. Morris last night said evolutionary scientists are enemies. Doesn't that understanding damage ICR's witness, since Christ came to save the lost and all of us were once enemies of God?
Well, he's my boss, so thank you so much for sticking me with that one. Well, I mean, the Bible does refer to, those who are in rebellion against God as enemies. I think we do have to be careful about that. So he wasn't wrong to say that. I mean, the Bible says that about them. But at the same time, we understand that, yeah, we were enemies of God. All of us. We were once enemies of God. And if it weren't for God's grace, we would be in exactly the same boat as the people who are still enemies of God. And so that, I think, is the attitude that we need to have as Christians. If you have that attitude, if you understand, look, I know this person is an enemy of God, they're rebelling against God, but so was I. And God stepped out and saved me, and I pray that he'll do the same thing for this person. If you have that kind of attitude, I think that's the way to go about it. We're not better than anybody else. We're forgiven, and we want to share that forgiveness. We want to show other people that God will be more than willing to forgive them too. And so I think that's probably the way we ought to think about it.
And since he's my boss too, well, I'll stick our neck out here a little bit. And I'm glad actually someone asked the question for a little clarification, because we were all enemies. We were all alienated. We were all sinners. And that is true. However, there seems to be a group of people that have set themselves deliberately opposed to God. And there's a passage in Scripture here in Psalm 139. And I've always found it kind of ironic. When I was a student at Moody, I asked several professors about this and how they explain this. And David says, "How precious are your thoughts towards me, O God? How great is the sum of them? If I should count them, there are more than the numbers of the sands of the sea. When I awake, they are still with me." And then he says in verse 19, so it follows right on this. "Surely you will slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloody men. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate you? And am I not grieved by those that rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies." And then he says this, "Search me, O God, and know my heart, and try me, and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Does anybody see what's kind of ironic here? Search my heart and know me. And then a verse before that, he says, "Those who hate you, I hate them. And those who are opposed to you, they're my enemies." You know how I finally reconcile this? David's love and passion for the Lord was so pure, so right, and he was so loyal and zealous for his God that the very thought of not just sinners out there who are sinning, but people who are these people, they shake their fists in the face of God and count God their enemy.